There was never a single road. No straight path stretched from one end of the world to the other, no marked trail worn smooth by countless feet that could be followed without question. Instead, there existed a shifting web of routes, some faint and temporary, others more deeply carved into the earth, spreading like threads across deserts, mountains, and forgotten plains. These paths appeared and vanished with the seasons, bent to the will of kings, and dissolved beneath wind and sand. To speak of the Silk Road as one road was to misunderstand it entirely. It was a journey not defined by certainty, but by choice. A traveler standing at the edge of departure would not see a clear direction laid before them. They would see only possibilities, caravan routes whispered about in markets, stories of distant cities carried by merchants, rumors shaped by memory and fear. Some paths led north through wind-swept grasslands where the horizon seemed endless and the sky pressed low and heavy. Others curved southward toward lands of heat and shifting sands, where the sun ruled without mercy. And still others climbed into the mountains, narrow and treacherous, where the air thinned and the ground itself seemed uncertain. Each choice carried its own dangers. Each path once taken would close behind them. And so the journey began not with a step, but with a decision. Those who set out did so knowing that there would be no single guide to follow, no guarantee of arrival. Maps, where they existed, were incomplete and often wrong, shaped by fragments of knowledge rather than true understanding. A river might be drawn where none flowed. A city might be marked long after it had fallen to ruin. Distances were guessed, not measured, and the space between places could stretch far beyond expectation. The road was not something one could trust. Instead, travelers placed their faith in other things, those who had walked before them, the movements of caravans, the quiet instincts born of experience. Knowledge passed from one voice to another, carried in conversations beneath dim lantern light, or exchanged in brief encounters along the way. Even then, it was never complete. Each traveler held only a piece of the whole, and no one could see the entire path at once. This uncertainty was not merely an inconvenience, it was the very nature of the journey. To walk these routes was to accept that the world would not reveal itself all at once. It would unfold slowly, often reluctantly, and not always truthfully. What seemed near could remain distant for weeks. What appeared safe could quickly turn dangerous. Familiar ground could give way without warning to terrain that tested both body and spirit. And yet, despite this, people came. They came from cities filled with noise and color, carrying goods that had been crafted with care, silks that shimmered in the light, spices that held the scent of distant lands, metals shaped into tools or ornaments. They came from quiet villages, drawn by stories of opportunity or by the simple need to survive. Some sought wealth, others sought knowledge. A few were driven by something less easily named, a restless pull toward the unknown.
Each of them stepped onto the road with a different purpose, but the road itself made no distinction between them. Once they had begun, they were all the same. The distance ahead did not shorten for the wealthy, nor did the hardships ease for the experienced. The desert did not offer mercy to those who had traveled it before, and the mountains did not lower themselves for those who carried greater burdens. The road demanded the same from everyone: endurance, patience, and the quiet acceptance that not everything could be controlled. It was not a road that could be conquered. It was one that had to be endured. As caravans formed and dissolved, as travelers joined and departed, the routes shifted in subtle ways. A well might dry, forcing a detour. A region might become unsafe, closing off a once favored path. Seasons changed the land itself. Rivers swelled or receded. Winds carved new shapes into the dunes. Snow blocked the mountain passes. What had been known one year could become uncertain the next. In this way, the Silk Road was always changing. It resisted permanence. It refused to be fixed. And so those who walked it could never rely entirely on the past. They had to remain aware, attentive to the smallest signs, the color of the sky at dawn, the behavior of their animals, the stories carried by those they met along the way. These details, often overlooked by those who lived in stable places, became essential. A shift in the wind might signal a coming storm. A distant shape on the horizon might be a caravan or something else entirely. The road taught its lessons slowly and often harshly. But before any of that could be learned, before the desert stretched out endlessly, before the mountains rose to meet the sky, before hunger and thirst and exhaustion began to take their toll, there was a quieter moment, a moment of stillness at the beginning. It came just before departure, when the traveler stood at the edge of the known world. Behind them lay familiarity, the streets they had walked, the voices they recognized, the life they understood. Ahead lay only uncertainty, shaped by stories and imagination, but not yet by experience. In that moment, the road was not yet real. It existed only as an idea, vast and distant, its hardships softened by the distance of thought. It was easy then to believe in the journey as something grand, something meaningful, something that would unfold as expected. But the road, in truth, was none of these things. It did not exist to fulfill expectations or reward ambition. It did not promise safety, nor did it guarantee success. It simply existed, vast, indifferent, and ever-changing. And once the first step was taken, there would be no easy way to return to that moment of stillness. The road would begin to reveal itself, piece by piece, in ways that could not be predicted or avoided. And the traveler, whether prepared or not, would follow. The journey did not begin on the road. It began long before, in the quiet spaces where decisions were made and preparations slowly took shape. There was no sudden departure, no impulsive step into the unknown. To travel the great routes between distant lands required patience, planning, and a careful gathering of all that might be needed for what lay ahead, though no one could ever truly gather enough. In the markets of great cities, the work began. Merchants moved through crowded streets where voices overlapped and goods were displayed in careful abundance. Rolls of silk shimmered in soft light, their colors shifting with every movement. Spices, measured in small quantities yet worth more than their weight, released their scent into the air, sharp, sweet, and unfamiliar. Metal tools, pottery, carved ornaments, and woven textiles filled the stalls, each object chosen not only for its beauty, but for its value in lands far away. Every item carried was a risk. Too little, and the journey might not be worth the cost. Too much, and the burden would slow the caravan, drain its strength, and increase the chance of loss. The balance was never certain. What sold well in one place might be unwanted in another.
What was precious in one city might be common in the next, and yet choices had to be made. Goods were selected with care, but also with hope. Alongside the gathering of trade came the assembling of animals. Camels were favored above all, their broad feet and steady endurance suited to the long stretches of desert where other creatures would falter. They were not gentle animals, nor easy to command, but they carried weight with a patience that few could match. Horses and donkeys were added where needed, each with its own strengths, each requiring its own care. To prepare the animals was to prepare for survival itself. They were loaded slowly, their burdens measured and secured with rope and cloth. Water skins were counted and recounted. Food was packed in ways that would preserve it for as long as possible, dried, salted, hardened against spoilage. Tools were gathered not for comfort, but for necessity. Knives, simple cooking vessels, materials for repair. There was little room for anything that did not serve a purpose. Even so, it was never enough. There were always limits to what could be carried, and beyond those limits lay uncertainty. A journey that might take months could stretch into years. Supplies could be lost, stolen, or consumed more quickly than expected. What seemed sufficient at the beginning often proved fragile against the demands of the road. Yet preparation was not only material. It was also a matter of choosing companions. Few traveled alone, not by choice. The dangers of the road made solitude a risk that most could not afford. And so caravans formed, groups of merchants, laborers, guards, and guides, each bringing their own purpose, their own knowledge, and their own quiet concerns. Some had traveled before and spoke with measured confidence. Others were new to the journey, their understanding shaped more by stories than by experience. Trust was necessary, but never complete. Strangers became companions not through familiarity, but through shared need. Each person relied on the others, even while knowing that circumstances could change. Hardship had a way of revealing truths that were not visible at the beginning, and the bonds formed in preparation were often tested in ways no one could predict. Among them were guides, whose knowledge was valued above all. They knew the routes not as lines on a map, but as memories carried within them, where water could be found, which paths were safer in certain seasons, where danger was most likely to appear. Their understanding was shaped by years of travel, by observation, and by experience that could not easily be passed on. Even so, their knowledge was not perfect. The road changed, and what had once been certain could become uncertain without warning. Still, without them, the journey would be far more perilous. As the caravan took shape, there remained the quiet matter of departure. It came not with noise, but with a kind of stillness. There were no grand ceremonies to mark the leaving, no assurance that the journey would end as intended. Those who remained behind understood what the road demanded. They had heard the stories, or perhaps seen others leave and never return. Farewells were often simple, a final exchange of words, a look held for a moment longer than usual, a silence that carried more than speech could express. There was no way to fully prepare for absence, no certainty that the separation would be temporary. The road did not promise return, and so each departure held within it the weight of the unknown. For the traveler, this moment lingered. It was the last time the world felt familiar, the last time everything was known and understood. Beyond this point, the journey would begin to reshape perception itself. time would stretch, distance would lose its meaning, and the simple comforts of daily life would fade into memory. Yet even as this awareness settled, there was no turning back. Too much had been gathered, too much set into motion. The caravan was ready, its purpose fixed, its direction chosen. To remain behind would mean abandoning not only the journey, but all that had been invested in it. And so, when the moment came, it came quietly. The animals were led forward, their movements slow but steady beneath the weight they carried. The travelers followed, adjusting to the rhythm that would soon define their days. The sounds of the city, voices, movement, life began to fade with each step, replaced by a growing silence. At first, the road did not seem so different. The land beyond the city still held signs of inhabitation, fields, scattered dwellings, the distant presence of others who lived and worked within sight of familiar structures. But even in these early stages, something had changed. The sense of belonging that once was constant began to loosen, replaced by a quiet awareness of distance. The known world was already slipping behind them. There was no clear boundary where it ended, no line that marked the transition. It happened gradually, almost unnoticed, until the traveler realized that what lay behind could no longer be easily returned to. The road had taken hold, and its path now stretched forward, uncertain and unyielding. The journey had begun, and everything that had been prepared, every item chosen, every companion trusted, every thought carried quietly within, would soon be tested in ways that could not yet be understood.
In the beginning, the road did not seem so harsh. The land unfolded gently, as though easing the traveler into what lay ahead. The air still carried the memory of the city, faint traces of smoke, distant voices that seemed almost within reach if one listened closely enough. The ground was familiar, shaped by those who had walked it often, and the presence of others could still be felt in the small signs left behind, worn paths, scattered footprints, the occasional structure standing quietly against the horizon. For a time, it was possible to believe that the journey might not be so difficult after all. The caravan moved at a steady pace, its rhythm slow but deliberate. There was no urgency in these early days, no need to press forward beyond what was comfortable. The animals found their footing easily, their steps measured and calm beneath the weight they carried. The travelers adjusted themselves to the movement, learning to walk for long hours, to rise and rest with the changing light, to settle into a pattern that would soon become routine. Morning came with a quiet stirring. Before the sun had fully risen, there was already movement within the caravan. Figures emerged from sleep, their forms dim in the fading darkness, as fires were rekindled and simple meals prepared. The air held a brief coolness, a moment of stillness before the heat of the day would take hold. It was in these early hours that the journey felt most manageable, when the road stretched ahead without yet revealing its true demands. As the sun climbed higher, the land began to shift. The signs of habitation grew fewer. The scattered dwellings became more distant, then disappeared entirely. The fields gave way to open ground, where the earth seemed less tended, less certain. The path itself became harder to follow, no longer clearly marked, but suggested only by the direction of those who walked ahead. It was here that the first quiet unease began to settle. There was no clear moment when the traveler realized that they had truly left the known world behind. It happened gradually,
almost imperceptibly, until the absence of familiar things became undeniable. The sounds of the city were gone, replaced by a vast and open silence. The horizon widened, stretching farther than it had before, offering no clear indication of what lay beyond it. The road no longer felt guided. Instead, it felt chosen, again and again, with each step forward. The caravan pressed on, its members growing quieter as the day wore on. Conversations, once easy and frequent, became less common. Words were no longer needed in the same way. Each traveler turned inward, not only adjusting to the physical demands of the journey, but to the subtle shift in awareness that came with it. The world had grown larger, and they had grown smaller within it. Dust began to rise more easily beneath their feet, carried by the wind in slow, drifting patterns. It settled on clothing, on skin, on the surfaces of the goods they carried, dulling their colors and softening their edges. There was no escaping it. It became part of the journey, a quiet presence that marked the passage of time. By midday, the heat began to press down more firmly. What had once been comfortable became demanding. The sun no longer felt distant, but immediate, its presence constant and unyielding. Shadows shortened, offering little relief. The movement of the caravan slowed slightly, not from choice, but for necessity. Each step required more effort, each breath carried a dryness that lingered. Still, the road continued, and so did they. There was a certain determination in these early days, a sense that the journey, though unfamiliar, could be mastered with patience. The hardships were present, but they had not yet deepened. There was still strength in the body, still clarity in the mind. The challenges ahead were imagined, but not fully understood. As the day came to an end, the caravan would stop. The choice of where to rest was not made lightly even now. Water sources, however small, were considered carefully. The ground was observed for signs of safety, subtle indications that the place had been used before, or that it offered some measure of protection. Fires were lit sparingly, their light contained, their smoke kept to a minimum. Even in these early stages, caution was already a necessity. Night brought with it a different kind of quiet. The sky, vast and unbroken, revealed more stars than many had ever seen. They stretched across the darkness in silent patterns, distant and unmoving, offering no guidance to those who did not know how to read them. The air cooled quickly, the heat of the day fading as though it had never been there at all. For some, this brought a sense of calm. For others, it deepened the awareness of how far they had come from everything familiar. Sleep, when it came, was lighter than before. The ground was harder, the sounds unfamiliar. The movements of the animals, the shifting of others nearby, the distant whisper of wind across open land, all of it carried a subtle tension. Rest was possible, but never complete. And with the coming of morning, it would begin again. Day by day, step by step, the distance from the known world increased. At first, it was measured in miles, then in time, and soon it would no longer be measured at all, but simply felt, a quiet understanding that what had been left behind was no longer within reach. The journey had not yet shown its harshest truths, but already it had begun to change those who walked it. Not in ways that could be seen at a glance, but in small, quiet shifts, in the way they listened to the wind, in the way they watched the horizon, in the way they conserved their strength without thinking. The road was teaching them even now, though its lessons were still gentle. That gentleness would not last, for beyond the edges of these early days, the land would begin to reveal itself more fully, less forgiving, more demanding, shaped not for ease of passage, but for endurance. And when that time came, the memory of these first steps would feel distant, almost irreal, like something that belonged to another journey entirely.
As the days lengthened into one another, the journey began to settle into a rhythm that no one had planned, yet everyone came to follow. There was no spoken agreement, no formal structure that bound the travelers together, and yet the caravan moved as though guided by an unseen understanding. Each person learned their place within it, not through instruction, but through repetition. What began as uncertainty slowly shaped itself into routine, and within that routine, life took on a quiet, measured form. The road no longer felt like a beginning. It had become a way of being. At dawn, before the first light fully revealed the land, the caravan stirred to life. There was a stillness in these early moments, a kind of muted awareness as bodies rose from rest and prepared once more for movement. Fires were rekindled from the faint remains of the night before, coaxed gently back into flame. The air held a brief coolness, fragile and fleeting, and it was in this time that the travelers worked most efficiently. There were no wasted movements. Bundles were checked and secured again, even if they had not been disturbed. Ropes were tightened, knots inspected with quiet care. Water skins were lifted and weighed, their contents measured not only by sight, but by feel. The animals were tended with equal attention, their loads adjusted, their condition observed in silence. A slight change in their posture, a hesitation in their step, could carry meaning that would only be understood later. Nothing was done without purpose. Food, when it was taken, was simple and sparing. It was not a time for indulgence, but for sustenance. The act of eating became less about pleasure and more about preparation, fuel for the long hours ahead. Conversation was minimal, not out of unwillingness, but out of necessity. Words, like everything else, were used carefully. And then, as the first light stretched across the horizon, they moved. The caravan did not rush. Its pace was steady, deliberate, shaped by the slow endurance of the animals and the measured steps of those who walked beside them. There was a quiet understanding that speed offered no advantage. To move too quickly was to invite exhaustion, and exhaustion on such a journey carried consequences that could not be easily undone. So they walked, hour after hour, beneath a sky that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. The land unfolded before them in subtle variations, sometimes flat and open, sometimes uneven and uncertain, but always stretching farther than it seemed it should. The horizon remained distant, no matter how long they moved toward it. Within the caravan, each traveler existed both alone and together. There were moments when the presence of others brought a sense of steadiness. The sound of footsteps, the shifting of burdens, the quiet breathing of animals, all of it formed a kind of shared existence, a reminder that no one walked the road entirely by themselves. Yet there were also long stretches where silence settled deeply, and each person withdrew into their own thoughts, their own endurance. It was a fragile balance. Too much isolation could weaken the spirit. Too much reliance on others could lead to disappointment, and so the travelers learned, slowly, to exist within that space between, aware of one another, yet not dependent, connected, yet still alone in the experience of the journey. Trust, like everything else, was measured carefully. It did not come easily, nor was it given without reason. The road had a way of revealing what lay beneath the surface, but it did so over time.
In the beginning, people spoke more freely, their words shaped by curiosity and the need to understand those around them. But as the journey continued, conversations grew quieter, more deliberate. What mattered was not what was said, but what was done. A shared burden carried without complaint, a warning given at the right moment, a watch kept through the night without being asked. These were the things that built trust, not quickly, but steadily, in ways that could be relied upon when it was most needed. Yet, even then, it was never absolute. The road demanded cooperation, but it did not remove self-interest. Each traveler carried their own purpose, their own concerns, and in times of hardship, those differences could become more pronounced. The balance between unity and individuality was never fully resolved. It shifted just as the road itself shifted, shaped by circumstance and necessity. By midday, the rhythm began to change. The heat pressed down more heavily, and the pace of the caravan slowed in response. There was no resistance to this adjustment. It came naturally, guided by experience rather than instruction. The travelers learned to conserve their strength, to move with the conditions rather than against them. Shade, when it could be found, became a brief refuge, but such moments were rare and often fleeting. More often, the journey continued beneath the open sky, where the sun offered no mercy. The body adapted as best it could, learning to endure rather than resist. Sweat dried as quickly as it formed, leaving behind a persistent dryness that settled into the skin and did not easily fade. Still, they moved. There was no alternative. As the day began to draw toward its end, attention turned once more to the matter of rest. The choice of where to stop was guided by careful observation. Signs of water, however faint, were considered. The condition of the animals weighed heavily in the decision. A place that offered even a small advantage, a slight shelter from wind, a patch of firmer ground, was chosen over one that did not. When the caravan finally came to a halt, there was no sense of completion, only a pause. The tasks of the evening began immediately. Loads were eased from the animals, their burdens lifted with care that had become instinctive. Water was measured and distributed, never wasted, always accounted for. Food was prepared in silence or near silence, the small fires casting a dim and flickering light against the growing darkness. It was in these moments that the quiet bonds within the caravan became most visible. Not through words, but through presence. The simple act of sitting near one another, of sharing space in a place that offered little comfort, carried its own meaning. There was a recognition, unspoken yet understood, that each person depended on the others, even if that dependence was never fully acknowledged. Night settled slowly. The sky darkened, revealing again the vast expanse above, a constant presence, unchanged by the distance traveled below. The air cooled, sometimes gently, sometimes with a sharpness that surprised those who had grown accustomed to the heat of the day. Sleep came, but never deeply. There were always sounds, the shifting of animals, the movement of wind, the quiet stirrings of those who remained awake to watch. Rest was taken in intervals, never fully surrendered to. The body recovered as it could, but always with an awareness that it might need to rise again at any moment. And then, as before, morning would return. The rhythm would begin again, unchanged, unbroken. Day after day, this pattern continued, shaping the lives of those within the caravan. It was not a life of ease, nor one of constant struggle, but something in between, a steady endurance, carried forward through habit, necessity, and the quiet determination to continue. Within this rhythm, the road began to reveal itself more fully. not all at once, but in fragments, in the weight of each step, in the silence between words, in the slow understanding that the journey was not something to be completed quickly, but something to be lived through, one measured moment at a time. And with each passing day, the caravan moved farther away from what had once been familiar and deeper into a world that would demand more than they had yet been asked to give.
At first, the burdens seemed manageable. When the caravan had set out, each load had been measured with care, every bundle tied, every strap secured with the quiet confidence that it would hold. The goods were arranged with purpose, balanced across the backs of camels, divided in ways that made sense in the stillness of preparation. Even the smallest items had been considered, their place chosen deliberately. In those early days, the weight was something understood. It could be seen, touched, adjusted. It rested on the animals, not yet fully felt by those who walked beside them. And so it was easy then to believe that it could be carried without consequence, that what had been gathered would remain as it was, unchanged until the journey's end. But the road had a way of revealing what could not be known at the beginning. As the days passed, the weight began to shift, not in its measure, but in its meaning. The ropes that once held firm began to strain, their fibers tightening under constant tension. Knots loosened with movement, requiring careful attention each morning and night. The loads themselves, though unchanged in substance, seemed heavier with each passing mile. What had been stable in stillness became uncertain in motion, swaying with each step, pulling against the balance of the animals that carried them. The burden was no longer just what was carried, it was what had to be maintained. Travelers learned quickly that nothing remained secure on its own. Every item required vigilance. A loosened strap left unattended could lead to loss. A shifting load could injure an animal, slowing the entire caravan. Even the smallest oversight could ripple outward, becoming something far greater than it first appeared. And so the act of carrying became constant. It was not enough to load the animals once and move forward. The weight had to be managed, adjusted, reconsidered again and again. Each stop brought with it the same careful process, checking, tightening, redistributing. What had seemed settled was never truly so. There was a quiet realization that came with this. The journey was not simply about moving forward, it was about preserving what was being brought along. And preservation came at a cost. Water, more than anything else, defined that cost. It was carried in skins that grew lighter with each passing day, their contents measured with increasing care. At the beginning, there had been enough to drink, enough to cook, enough to sustain both traveler and animal. But as distance stretched and the land offered little in return, that sense of enough began to fade. Every drop became something to consider. To drink freely was no longer possible. Thirst could not be answered without thought. Instead, it was managed, endured, delayed, acknowledged but not fully satisfied. The weight of water, once reassuring, became something else entirely. It was both necessity and burden, something that could not be left behind, yet could not be carried without consequence. Food followed the same path. What had once been sustenance began to feel like calculation. Portions grew smaller, not always from lack, but from caution. The journey ahead was never certain, and what remained had to be stretched across time that could not be measured with accuracy. Hunger became familiar, not sharp or overwhelming, but constant, a quiet presence that lingered beneath each step. And still there were other things carried: tools, garments,
small objects whose value lay not in their size but in their usefulness. Each had been chosen for a reason, yet the road had a way of questioning those reasons. Items that seemed essential began to feel less so when weighed against the effort required to transport them. The difference between necessity and excess blurred with each passing day. Decisions had to be made. They were not made easily. To leave something behind was to accept its loss completely. There was no returning for it, no guarantee that it would remain where it was left. And yet to carry everything was to risk something greater, the slowing of the caravan, the weakening of the animals, the gradual exhaustion of those who depended on them. So the travelers began to let go. At first it was small things, items that could be spared without much thought, left quietly at the edge of a resting place. But as the journey continued, the choices grew more difficult. What remained was not excess, but necessity, each piece carrying its own importance, each loss felt more deeply than the last. There was no moment when the burden disappeared, only a gradual reshaping of it. The physical weight lessened, but the understanding of it deepened. What was carried now was not just goods or supplies, but the awareness of limitation, the knowledge that everything had a cost, and that cost could not be avoided. Even the body itself became part of that burden. Strength, once taken for granted, began to feel finite. Each step required effort that could not be ignored. Muscles tightened, joints ached, and fatigue settled in ways that rest could not fully remove. The traveler carried themselves as much as they carried anything else, and that weight, too, had to be managed. There was no escaping it. The road did not allow for lightness. It demanded endurance, not only of the body, but of the mind. To continue was to accept the weight, not as something temporary, but as something constant, a companion that would not be set down until the journey itself had ended. And within the caravan, this understanding was shared, though rarely spoken. Each traveler knew the quiet strain of what they were carrying. Each recognized it in the movements of the others, the slight adjustments, the pauses that lingered just a moment longer, the careful way in which burdens were lifted and set down. It created a kind of silent connection, not one of comfort, but of recognition. They were all carrying more than they had expected. And still they moved forward. The road offered no relief from this. It did not grow easier with time, nor did it reward those who bore its weight with greater ease. Instead, it revealed, step by step, the true nature of what it meant to carry something across such distance. It was not simply a matter of strength. It was a matter of endurance, of choice, and of the quiet willingness to continue even when the burden began to feel greater than what could reasonably be held. And beyond the days already traveled, the road stretched on, longer, harsher, and more demanding still. The weight, in time, would not lessen. It would only become more difficult to bear.
There came a point when the land began to empty itself of all that felt familiar. It did not happen suddenly. The change unfolded slowly, almost gently at first, as the scattered signs of life grew fewer and farther between. The ground lost its softness, its variation, its quiet traces of human presence. What remained was something more exposed, more open, and far less forgiving. Then, without any clear boundary, the desert revealed itself. It stretched outward in every direction, vast and unbroken, as though the world had been reduced to its simplest form, earth and sky, light and silence. There were no markers to guide the way, no structures to suggest direction. The horizon widened until it seemed unreachable,
a distant line that remained constant no matter how far the caravan traveled. In this place, distance lost its meaning. What appeared near remained far. What seemed attainable receded with each step. The land offered no sense of progress, no indication that the journey was advancing at all. It was as though the caravan moved without truly arriving anywhere, suspended within a space that did not change. The sun ruled everything. It rose without obstruction, climbed without resistance, and settled into its place above the travelers with an unyielding presence. There was no shelter from it, no relief beyond what could be carried or created in small, fleeting moments. Its light was not gentle. It pressed down with a steady intensity, filling the air with heat that did not easily escape. By midday, the world seemed to shimmer. The air itself distorted the distance, bending light into shapes that could not be trusted. The ground appeared to ripple as though it were not solid, and in the far distance there were illusions, faint images of water, of shade, of movement where none existed. They hovered just beyond reach, convincing enough to draw the eye, but never close enough to become real. The desert did not deceive out of intent. It simply existed in a way that made certainty impossible. The travelers learned quickly not to trust what they saw. Vision, once a reliable guide, became uncertain. The horizon offered no answers, only distance. Landmarks, when they appeared, were temporary, shifting dunes shaped by wind, their forms changing from one day to the next. A path could not be fixed here. It had to be remembered, felt, carried within the mind, rather than followed beneath the feet. Even the wind carried its own kind of difficulty. At times it moved softly, barely noticeable against the stillness of the air. But when it gathered strength, it transformed the landscape itself. Sand lifted from the ground and traveled in restless waves, filling the air, stinging the skin, obscuring all that lay ahead. It settled into clothing, into eyes and mouths, into every uncovered surface, leaving behind a dryness that no amount of effort could fully remove. There were moments when the world seemed to disappear entirely. The sky faded behind a veil of moving sand, and the ground became uncertain beneath each step. In such moments, the caravan slowed, its movement cautious and deliberate. To lose direction here was not a small mistake. It was something that could not be easily corrected. And so they endured. They lowered their heads, covered what they could, and waited for the wind to pass. There was no resistance to it, no attempt to move against its force. The desert demanded patience, and those who did not give it were quickly reminded of their limits. Water, already precious, became something more than necessity. It became the measure of time. Each day was defined not only by distance traveled, but by what remained within the skins that were carried so carefully. Every pause brought with it the same quiet calculation. How much had been used, how much must be saved, how far the next source might be. There were no guarantees. Wells could be dry, oases could be farther than expected or changed by time and weather. Thirst was no longer occasional, it was constant. It lingered in the mouth, in the throat, in the slow heaviness of the body. It could not be fully answered, only managed. To drink was to reduce what remained, to wait was to endure. Each choice carried its own consequence, and there was no escaping the need to choose. The animals felt it as well. Their movements grew slower, their steps more deliberate. Their endurance, though greater than that of the travelers, was not without limit. They required care, attention, and water just as much as those that depended on them. A weakened animal could not carry its burden, and a burden left behind could not easily be replaced. Everything was connected. The desert allowed no separation between what was needed and what could be lost. As the days passed, the silence deepened. There were no distant voices, no signs of life beyond the caravan itself. Even the wind, when it stilled, left behind a quiet that felt almost complete. It was not a peaceful silence, but an empty one, vast, unbroken, and indifferent. In that silence, thoughts began to change. The mind, once filled with the concerns of departure and preparation, turned inward. There was little to distract from the steady rhythm of the journey. Step followed step, hour followed hour, and time stretched in ways that were difficult to measure. Days blurred together, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. It became easy to lose track of how far they had come, or how far remained. The desert offered no answers to either. And yet the caravan continued. There was no alternative. To stop was not to rest, but to risk. The journey through such land could not be paused for long. Movement, however slow, was necessary. The next source of water, the next place of refuge, however small, lay somewhere ahead, unseen but essential. And so they moved forward, guided not by certainty, but by the quiet understanding that stillness offered nothing. The desert did not welcome them. It did not resist them. It simply endured, vast and unchanged as they passed through it. And in doing so, it began to reveal one of the road's deepest truths, that survival was not a matter of strength alone, but of patience, awareness, and the willingness to continue, even when the land itself seemed to offer no reason to do so. Beyond the endless expanse, other trials waited, but within the desert there was only this: distance without measure, silence without comfort, and the slow, unrelenting passage of time beneath an unforgiving sky.
In the desert, thirst did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, unnoticed at first, like a shadow that lengthened only when the sun was highest and the world was at its brightest. At the beginning of the journey, water had been something measured and managed, but still familiar. It was carried, consumed, replaced when possible. It had limits, but those limits had not yet felt sharp. In the endless expanse, those limits became everything. There were no longer moments when thirst was absent. It lived beneath every thought, beneath every step, woven into the body itself. The mouth became dry even in stillness. The throat carried a constant roughness that no swallow could fully ease. Even breathing seemed to draw moisture away, leaving behind a quiet emptiness that deepened with time. Water was no longer simply a need. It was a presence that shaped the entire rhythm of life. Each morning began with a calculation, spoken or unspoken, as the skins were checked and weighed. What remained was never enough for comfort, only enough for continuation. Each sip was measured not by desire, but by necessity. To drink freely belonged to another world, one that now felt distant, almost unreal. And yet, in the midst of this restraint, the desert played its most subtle trick.
It offered the illusion of relief. At first, it came in the distance, a faint glimmer on the horizon, where the ground seemed to shift into something softer, something reflective. It appeared like water, still, inviting, undeniable in its resemblance. The sight could be so convincing that even those who knew better found their attention drawn towards it. The caravan would slow, eyes would linger. For a moment, the body would remember what water felt like, and that memory would rise with an intensity that made the illusion almost unbearable. But the closer one moved, the more it changed. The shimmering surface would retreat, never quite arriving, always maintaining its distance. What had seemed solid dissolved into heat and light, revealing itself as nothing more than distortion, air bent by temperature, vision shaped by exhaustion and desire. Still, it returned, again and again across different stretches of sand, under different angles of light. The desert did not need to deceive intentionally. It simply offered what the mind longed for and allowed expectation to do the rest. To those who had traveled only a short distance into the desert, it might have been mistaken for hope. To those who had endured longer, it became something else entirely, a reminder that the land itself could not be trusted to provide comfort, even in appearance. Real water was rare. When it came, it did not announce itself with spectacle. It was not distant or shimmering. It was quiet, often hidden, revealed only through knowledge or chance. A shallow well, a pool tucked between rock and earth, a place where life had gathered in defiance of the surrounding dryness. Such places were not found easily. They were remembered or discovered through guidance or stumbled upon after long uncertainty. And when they were found, they were treated not as relief alone, but as survival itself. The approach to water was always careful. No one moved quickly. There was a quiet discipline in the way the caravan would gather, animals restrained, voices lowered. Water was not taken all at once. It was measured again even in its presence, as though abundance itself might vanish if treated without caution. The act of drinking carried weight. It was never just about easing first. It was about preserving what remained, about ensuring that what was found could sustain what came next. Even in moments of relief, the awareness of scarcity never fully disappeared. And when the caravan left such places, there was always a silence that followed, not of loss, but of understanding. Because even water, when found, did not belong to them. It was part of the land, offered briefly, then withdrawn again as the journey continued. Between these moments of real relief, there was only endurance. The body adapted in ways that were not immediately noticeable. Movement became more economical, speech less frequent, breathing more deliberate. Energy was conserved not through choice alone, but by necessity. The desert taught restraint not as discipline, but as survival. Even thought began to shift. The mind learned to avoid unnecessary attention to thirst, though it could never fully escape it. Focus turned instead to immediate steps, to the next hour, to the faint possibility of what might lie ahead. Thinking too far forward only deepened discomfort. And so awareness narrowed, drawn into the present moment where survival was simplest to manage. Still, the illusion of relief never stopped appearing. It remained part of the landscape, as constant as the dunes themselves, a promise that could not be fulfilled, yet could not be ignored. It tested not only the body, but perception itself, asking again and again what could be trusted and what could not be. Over time, even the distinction between illusion and memory began to blur. The mind, stretched by exhaustion and heat, sometimes recalled water as if it were present, as if it could be reached again with only a few more steps. The feeling of it became vivid enough to momentarily soften the edges of reality, and when reality returned, it did so gently but firmly, reminding the traveler of what remained true. The desert did not offer comfort, it only offered continuation. There was no punishment in this, no intention behind the hardship. It was simply the nature of the place, vast, dry, and indifferent to the needs of those who crossed it. And yet, within that indifference, life persisted. Caravans continued to pass through, journeys continued to be made. Endurance became its own quiet understanding. For those who traveled long enough, thirst ceased to be an interruption. It became part of existence itself. Not something to be solved, but something to be carried, like the weight of goods, like the rhythm of footsteps, like the slow passage of time beneath an unchanging sky. And always just beyond reach, the illusion remained, a promise that could not be fulfilled, yet could not be relied upon.
When the sun finally lowered itself beyond the horizon, the desert did not soften, it changed. The heat, which had pressed down with such persistence throughout the day, began to withdraw with a quiet suddenness. The air lost its weight, its intensity fading as though it had never fully belonged to the land. What remained in its place was something sharper, thinner, and far less forgiving. The cold arrived without hesitation. At first it was subtle, a cooling of the wind, a slight relief from the heat that had lingered in the body, but that relief did not last. As darkness deepened, the temperature fell steadily, drawing warmth away from the ground, from the air, and from those who remained exposed beneath the open sky. There was no gradual adjustment. The desert did not allow for comfort in transition. The caravan, having endured the long hours of heat, now turned its attention to a different kind of endurance. The tasks of evening were carried out with quiet urgency. Fires were lit where they could be, small and controlled, their flames offering limited warmth against the growing cold. Fuel was scarce, gathered sparingly along the way, and so the fires could never be large. They flickered rather than burned. Their light stretched only a short distance, leaving much of the surrounding darkness untouched. Beyond their glow, the desert returned to its natural state, vast, silent, and unseen. The animals were settled first. Their burdens removed, their movements slowed, they gathered close together, their presence forming a kind of barrier against the open night. Even they, accustomed to the shifting extremes of the desert, felt the change. Their breaths became visible in the cooling air, rising and fading in pale, fleeting clouds. For the travelers, rest was not immediate. The body, still carrying the heat of the day, resisted the cold at first, but as time passed, that stored warmth diminished, leaving behind a growing awareness of exposure. Layers were drawn tighter, coverings adjusted, yet there was only so much that could be done. What had been sufficient during the day was often not enough for the night. The ground itself offered little comfort. It held none of the day's heat for long, releasing it quickly into the surrounding air. To lie upon it was to feel the cold rise steadily, seeping through fabric, settling into the body with a quiet persistence. Sleep, when it came, was never deep. It existed in brief intervals, broken by the need to shift, to adjust, to wake and rest again. Above them, the sky revealed itself fully. Freed from the brightness of the sun, it stretched outward in a way that felt almost limitless.
The stars appeared in numbers that could not be counted, their light steady and distant, unchanged by the movement of those below. They formed patterns that some could read, guiding direction and offering a kind of constancy in a landscape that otherwise resisted certainty. For others, they were simply there, a silent presence, vast and unmoving, watching over a world that did not pause. The night carried its own sounds, though they were few. The wind, when it moved, did so with a soft, steady voice, passing across the open land without obstruction. The animals shifted occasionally, their movements slow and deliberate. Beyond that, there was little else. No distant voices, no signs of life beyond the small circle of the caravan. It was a silence different from that of the day, not empty, but deep. It settled into the mind as much as the body, creating a space where thought could expand, unbroken by distraction. In this quiet, memories often returned, not sharply, but gently, rising without effort. The sounds of distant places, the warmth of familiar spaces, the presence of those left behind. They came not as longing, but as echoes, softened by time and distance. Yet even these did not remain for long. The demands of the present were never far. There was always the awareness of vulnerability. The darkness, though calm, concealed what could not be seen. The openness of the land offered no shelter, no clear protection. Those who kept watch did so with quiet attention, their senses attuned to the smallest changes, the shift of wind, the movement of shadow, the faintest sound beyond what was expected. Danger, if it came, would not announce itself. It would emerge from the same stillness that surrounded them. And so, even in rest, there was vigilance. The body might lie still, but the mind remained aware, never fully surrendering to sleep. This constant balance between rest and alertness became part of the rhythm of the journey, as essential as movement itself. As the night deepened, the cold reached its fullest expression. It settled into the bones, into the spaces between movement and stillness, where it lingered without urgency, yet without retreat. Time passed slowly in these hours, measured not by activity, but endurance. Each moment extended into the next, the darkness holding steady until the first signs of morning began to appear. And when they did, they came quietly. A faint shift in the horizon, a subtle change in the quality of the sky. The stars, once so vivid, began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, giving way to a softening light that signaled the end of night. And with it came a different kind of relief. Not warmth, not yet, but the promise of it. The caravan stirred once more, bodies rising from restless sleep, movement slow at first, then more certain. The cold still lingered, but it had begun to release its hold. The tasks of morning returned, familiar now, carried out with the same quiet efficiency as before. There was no lingering in the night. It was something to be endured, not embraced. And as the first light of day spread across the desert, the memory of the cold began to fade, replaced once again by the expectation of heat, of distance, of the long path ahead. The cycle continued, day into night, night into day, each bringing its own demands, its own challenges, its own quiet truths. And beneath it all, the road remained, unchanged in its vastness, indifferent to the passing of time, and ever waiting for those who continued to cross it.
Beyond the wide and unbroken deserts, where the land had stretched outward in silence, there came a place where the earth rose again. At first it appeared as a faint line along the horizon, darker than the sky, uneven in its shape, almost indistinct. But as the caravan moved closer
That line grew, lifting itself higher, revealing form and depth where before there had been only distance. The ground beneath their feet began to change as well, losing the soft, shifting quality of sand and taking on a firmer, more uneven character. The desert did not end, it gave way. What followed was not relief, but another kind of trial, one that demanded something different from those who crossed it. Where the desert tested endurance through openness and heat, the mountains tested it through resistance, through elevation, through the narrowing of space itself. The road, if it could still be called that, began to climb. It no longer stretched forward in long, uninterrupted lines. Instead, it wound upon itself, bending around the natural rise of the land, turning where it must, ascending slowly but without pause. There were no clear paths carved for easy passage, only routes shaped by those who had come before, faint, uneven, and often difficult to follow. Each step required attention. The ground was no longer predictable. Stones shifted beneath weight, loose gravel slid without warning, and narrow ledges demanded careful footing. The animals, so steady across the desert, moved differently here. Their pace slowed, their movements more deliberate, each step placed with instinctive caution. The burden they carried felt heavier, not because it had increased, but because the effort required to move it had grown. The upward path resisted them, drawing strength from the body with each step. What had once been a steady rhythm became something more strained, more uneven. Breath came differently now, shorter, more frequent, as the air itself began to change. It thinned as they climbed. At first it was barely noticeable, a slight adjustment in the way the lungs filled, a subtle awareness that each breath carried less than before. But as the elevation increased, that awareness deepened. The body worked harder for the same result, drawing in air that did not fully satisfy the need for it. Fatigue came more quickly. Steps that would have once passed without thought now required effort. The simplest movements carried weight beyond their measure. Even standing still offered little relief as the body struggled to recover what it had lost in motion. The mountains did not allow for ease, they demanded persistence. The path grew narrower in places, pressing the caravan into tight formations where there was little room to move freely. On one side, the land rose sharply, walls of rock and earth that offered no passage. On the other, it fell away, sometimes gradually, sometimes with sudden and unsettling depth. To look down was to see distance in a different form, not stretched across the horizon, but dropping away beneath the feet. Mistakes here carried consequences that could not be undone.
And so movement became cautious, measured not by distance but by stability. There was no rushing through such terrain, no attempt to make up for lost time. The mountain set its own pace, and those who crossed it had no choice but to follow. Weather, too, shifted in ways that could not be predicted from the lands below. Clouds gathered more quickly, forming without warning, obscuring the sky and the path ahead. Winds moved through the passes with sudden force, colder than anything the desert had offered, cutting through clothing and settling into the body with a sharp persistence. At times, the air carried moisture, thin at first, then more certain. Rain fell in brief, uneven patterns, turning the ground slick and uncertain. Higher still, it changed again, becoming something colder, lighter, settling upon the land in a way that altered its shape. Snow. For those who had known only heat and dryness, it felt almost unreal, and yet it brought its own challenges.
The path, already difficult, became harder to see. Footing grew uncertain, each step requiring even greater care. The cold, sharper than that of the desert night, lingered throughout the day, refusing to retreat even when the sun returned. The body was tested in ways that could not be avoided. Muscles strained against the constant incline. Breathing grew labored, uneven, each inhale a reminder of the thinning air. Rest, when taken, did not restore as it once had. The body recovered slowly, if at all, and the weight of fatigue carried forward into each new day. Even the mind began to feel the change. Where the desert had stretched thought outward into silence, the mountains drew it inward, focusing attention on each movement, each decision. There was little room for distraction. The present demanded full awareness, and anything less could lead to error. The caravan moved more quietly now, not from choice but from necessity. Words required breath, and breath was no longer abundant. Communication became simpler, reduced to what was needed, leaving the rest unspoken. And yet, even in this strain, there was a kind of clarity. The mountains revealed the limits of the body with honesty. They did not conceal their difficulty, nor did they offer false promises. What lay ahead was visible, even if it could not be easily reached. The path, though uncertain, existed. It rose, it turned, it continued. There was no illusion here, only effort. Days passed in slow ascent, each one bringing the caravan higher, deeper into the landscape that resisted them. Progress was measured not in distance alone, but in endurance, the ability to continue despite what the body demanded. And always there was the knowledge that the path would not rise forever. Somewhere ahead, beyond what could be seen, there would be a crossing, a place where the ascent would reach its limit and the land would begin to fall away once more. But reaching that place required patience and strength and the quiet willingness to endure what could not be avoided. Until then, the caravan held them, not as an obstacle to be overcome quickly, but as a passage to be endured fully. And step by step, breath by measured breath, the caravan continued its slow and uncertain climb into the heights.
There was no clear moment when the body began to fail. It did not happen all at once, nor did it announce itself with certainty. Instead, it revealed itself in small, quiet ways, changes so subtle that they could be mistaken for ordinary fatigue, for the natural wear of the journey. A lingering heaviness in the limbs, a dull ache that did not fade with rest, a breath drawn more slowly than before. At first, these things were ignored. The road demanded continuation, and so long as the body could move, there was little reason to dwell on what might be passing discomfort. Each traveler carried some measure of strain. It was expected, accepted, and endured without question. But there were times when the body did not recover. A cough that returned again and again, a fever that settled in the heat of the day and deepened in the cold of the night, a weakness that did not lift with morning, but remained, growing slowly, quietly, until it could no longer be set aside. Illness, when it came, did not come gently. It took hold in a place where there was no refuge from it. There were no healers waiting along the road, no prepared remedies beyond what could be carried, and even those were limited. Simple herbs, small measures of knowledge passed between travelers, fragments of understanding shaped by experience rather than certainty. What could be done was often little, and what was needed was often more. The caravan could not stop for long. To remain in one place was to risk more than illness alone.
Supplies would diminish, water would grow scarce, and the dangers of the land would not lessen simply because one among them had fallen unwell. Movement was survival, and survival did not always allow for delay. And so those who grew ill were carried forward as best they could be. At first they walked. They kept pace, though their steps grew slower, their posture less certain. They spoke less, conserving what little strength remained. Others noticed but said little. There was an understanding that needed no voice. Each traveler watched, quietly aware of the change. When walking became too difficult, there were other measures. Space was made among the loads, a place where the ill could rest, carried by the same animals that bore goods meant for trade. It was not comfortable, nor was it without cost. Every added weight shifted the balance of the caravan, increasing the strain on what remained. But still, it was done. There was no choice. Care, when given, was simple. Water, measured carefully, was offered in small amounts. Cloths were adjusted, coverings shifted to guard against heat or cold. Words, when spoken, were quiet and few. Reassurance offered not in promises, but in presence. There was little else to give. Time moved differently around illness. Where the journey once followed a steady rhythm, now it seemed to hesitate, to slow in subtle ways. The focus shifted, not entirely, but enough to be felt. Attention, once spread across the road ahead, turned inward, toward the one who struggled to continue.
But the road did not change. It remained as it was, indifferent to the condition of those who crossed it. The sun rose, the path climbed or descended, the distance stretched on. Illness did not alter these things. It existed alongside them, shaping the experience of the journey without altering its course. Some recovered. Slowly, often without clear reason, strength would begin to return. The fever would break, the breath would steady. Steps, once uncertain, would find rhythm again. It was never a sudden transformation, but a gradual return, fragile at first, then more certain. These moments carried quiet relief, not spoken, but shared in the subtle easing of tension, in the return of familiar movement, in the simple continuation of the journey without the weight of uncertainty pressing so closely. But not all recovered. There were times when the illness deepened, when the body did not respond, when strength continued to fade despite every effort. In these moments, the limits of what could be done became clear. There was no remedy to turn to, no place to seek refuge, only the road and the quiet passage of time. Those who could no longer continue were faced with a reality that few spoke of, yet all understood. The journey demanded movement, and movement could not always carry everyone to its end. There were decisions that had to be made, not quickly, not without thought, but with a clarity shaped by necessity. To remain behind was to face the land alone. To be carried forward was to place greater strain on those who remained. Neither path offered certainty. And so choices were made in silence, guided not by ease, but what could be endured. For those who continued, the presence of illness left its mark. It lingered in the awareness of the body, in the understanding that strength was not permanent, that endurance had limits that could be reached without warning. It altered the way each step was taken, the way each breath was considered. The road no longer felt like something that could simply be endured through will alone. It required something more, an acceptance of uncertainty, of vulnerability, of the quiet truth that not everything could be overcome.
Even among those who remained well, the fear of illness settled quietly. It was not spoken, not often acknowledged, but it was there, in the careful sharing of water, in the attention given to small changes in the body, in the awareness that what had happened to one could happen to another. There was no escape from it. The journey continued as it always did. Day followed day, step followed step, the caravan moving forward through landscapes that offered no pause for weakness. And within that movement, the body was tested not only by distance in terrain, but by itself, by its ability to endure, to recover, or to fail. In this way, illness became part of the road, not an interruption, but a presence, a reminder that the journey was not only measured by the land crossed, but by the condition of those who crossed it, and that both could change in ways that could not be predicted and could not always be controlled. And still they moved forward.
The road was never truly empty. Even in the long stretches where no life seemed to exist, where the horizon held nothing but distance and silence, there remained the quiet possibility that others moved unseen. The caravan, though alone in its path, was never beyond the reach of those who watched, waited, and followed not for trade, but for opportunity of a different kind. This knowledge settled slowly. At first it was only a thought, something carried in stories, spoken of in preparation, acknowledged but not fully felt. But as the journey continued, as the distance from places of order and protection grew, that thought began to take shape, becoming something more present, more immediate. The road offered no protection. There were no walls, no boundaries that could be trusted to keep danger at bay. What existed was openness, vast and unguarded, and within that openness, the possibility of encounter. Bandits did not announce themselves. They did not approach in ways that could be easily anticipated or avoided. They moved with knowledge of the land, understanding where caravans might pass, where the terrain narrowed, where movement slowed. They watched from a distance, often unseen, learning the rhythm of those they followed. There were signs, though they were not always clear. A shape on the horizon that lingered longer than expected, tracks that did not belong to the caravan, appearing and then disappearing again. The faint impression that something had shifted, that the silence carried a different weight. Those who had traveled before recognized these signs. Their awareness sharpened, their movements becoming more deliberate. The caravan adjusted without needing to be told, tightening its formation, keeping closer together, reducing the distance between its members. Guards, where they existed, remained more alert, their attention fixed not only on the path ahead, but on what might approach from any direction. Even so, certainty was never possible. The line between caution and fear was thin. Too much caution could slow the journey, drain energy, create tension where none was needed. Too little could leave the caravan unprepared for what might come. And so they walked within that space between, watchful but not panicked, aware but not consumed by the possibility of danger. It was a balance that could not always be held. There were moments when the presence of others became undeniable, a distant movement no longer uncertain, figures appearing where there had been none before, the slow, deliberate approach of those who had chosen to reveal themselves. In these moments, the quiet tension that had lingered beneath the surface rose fully into awareness. The caravan did not scatter. To do so would be to invite greater risk. Instead, it drew inward, forming a closer, more unified presence.
Voices, if raised, were controlled. Movements were careful, measured. There was no sudden action, no reckless attempt to flee what could not be outrun. The encounter unfolded in stillness. Sometimes it ended without conflict. A silent understanding passed between the groups, an acknowledgement of presence, of strength, of the cost that conflict would bring to both sides. The distance between them remained, and after a time it widened again, each continuing on their separate path.
But not all encounters ended this way. There were times when intention was clear, when the approach carried not curiosity, but purpose. In such moments, the road revealed another of its truths, that what was carried was never entirely secure, and that possession was always temporary. Resistance, when it came, was brief. The caravan was not built for battle. Its strength lay in endurance, in movement, in the quiet persistence of its journey. To fight was to risk more than loss. It was to risk disruption, injury, and the breaking of what fragile order had been maintained. And so, when faced with force, there were times when the choice was made to yield. Goods were taken. Items that had been gathered with care, carried across distance, and protected through hardship were removed without ceremony. The loss was immediate, undeniable, yet it was accepted in a way that spoke not of weakness, but of understanding. The journey, above all, had to continue. What was lost could not be reclaimed in that moment. To pursue it would be to abandon the path, to invite greater danger, to risk everything that remained. And so the caravan endured the loss, adjusting once more to the altered weight it carried. There were other dangers as well. Not all threats came from beyond the caravan. Hardship had a way of shaping people, of revealing what lay beneath the surface. Trust, carefully built over time, could weaken under strain. Decisions made in moments of exhaustion or fear did not always align with what had once been understood. A misplaced item, a portion taken without notice, a word spoken too sharply or not spoken at all. These were small things, but in the confines of the journey they carried weight. Betrayal, when it appeared, was rarely sudden. It grew in quiet ways, through imbalance, through tension left unresolved, through the slow erosion of trust that had never been absolute. When it revealed itself, it did so without spectacle, often in moments where the cost was already felt. There were no clear answers to such things. To confront it directly risked further division, to ignore it invited its return. And so, like many aspects of the journey, it was managed rather than solved, contained within the shared understanding that survival depended on some form of unity, even if that unity was imperfect. Fear became a constant companion, not overwhelming, not always present at the surface, but woven into the awareness of each step. It shaped the way the caravan moved, the way decisions were made, the way the land itself was perceived. It was not a fear that stopped the journey, it was one that moved with it. Over time, it changed. What had once been sharp and immediate softened into something more familiar. It did not disappear, but it became part of the rhythm of the road, another element to be acknowledged, adjusted to, carried forward without allowing it to take control. The travelers learned to live alongside it, to recognize its presence without being consumed by it, to remain aware without losing their sense of direction. It was not a lesson that came easily, nor one that was ever fully mastered, but it was necessary. For the road did not promise safety. It did not offer protection from those who sought to take what was carried, nor from the quiet fractures that could form within the caravan itself. It simply extended forward, indifferent to conflict, unchanged by loss, waiting for those who continued to walk it. And so, with what remained and with what had been altered, the caravan moved on.
carrying not only goods and supplies, but the growing understanding that danger was not an exception to the journey. It was part of it, as constant as the road itself.
There came a time when the land began to change in ways that could not be mistaken. It was not only the shape of the ground, nor the color of the earth beneath their feet. It was something less visible, yet immediately felt. A shift in presence, in movement, in the quiet signs of life that began to return after long stretches of emptiness. At first it was subtle, a distant figure where none had been before, the faint outline of structures rising against the horizon, not as ruins or abandoned forms, but as places still inhabited. The path, once uncertain and shifting, grew more defined, marked by the passage of others who had come and gone. The caravan had entered lands that belonged to others. There was no clear boundary to mark the transition, no line drawn across the earth to signal arrival, and yet it was understood. The silence of the desert gave way to something more layered, more complex. The air carried sounds again, distant voices, the movement of animals, the quiet activity of lives lived beyond the caravan's own. With this return of life came a different kind of uncertainty. The road was no longer shaped solely by the land. It was shaped by people, by customs that were not always known, by expectations that were not always clear, by ways of living that differed from those left behind. The traveler, once defined by endurance alone, now had to navigate something less tangible, understanding, or the absence of it. As the caravan approached settlements, the rhythm of movement slowed. There was no rush to enter, no assumption that passage would be granted without question. These places, though offering the possibility of rest and exchange, were not without their own conditions. They belonged to those who lived within them, and those who arrived from afar were not always welcomed without hesitation. First encounters were often quiet. The caravan would be observed before it was approached. Figures stood at a distance, watching, measuring, taking in what had arrived at the edge of their world. The travelers, in turn, became aware of themselves in a different way, of their appearance, their movement, the goods they carried, and the impression they gave without speaking. Language, when it came, did not always bridge the gap. Words spoken in one place carried different meanings in another. Sounds that were familiar to some were unfamiliar to others, shaped by tongues that moved differently, by traditions that had grown apart over time. Communication became an act of patience, of gesture, of careful listening rather than immediate understanding. Trade, however, offered a common ground. It existed not in shared language, but in shared need. Goods were brought forward, displayed not with certainty, but with quiet intention. Value was expressed through exchange, through the weighing of objects, the comparison of what was given and what was received. It was a process that required attention, restraint, and an awareness that not all things were valued equally across different lands. What seemed precious in one place might be ordinary in another. And what seemed ordinary might carry significance that could not be easily recognized. There were moments of success, items exchanged, needs met, the caravan gaining what it required to continue: food, water, materials, information. These exchanges, though simple in form, carried a deeper importance. They allowed the journey to move forward, to extend beyond what had been possible before. But not all encounters were so smooth.
Misunderstandings arose, often without intention. A gesture interpreted differently, a word taken in a way not meant. The absence of shared understanding could turn even the simplest interaction into something uncertain. In these moments, caution became essential. The traveler learned to move carefully, not only in body, but in expression, to observe before acting, to listen before speaking, to recognize that what was known in one place did not always apply in another. It was a form of awareness that extended beyond the road itself, into the spaces where human lives intersected in ways both brief and lasting. Within these foreign lands, the caravan was both visible and separate. It carried with it the marks of distance, the dust of the road, the wear of travel, the quiet difference that set it apart from those who remained rooted in one place. It was neither fully part of the world it entered, nor entirely outside of it. It existed between, moving through, without belonging. This separation was not always unkind. There were moments of welcome, of quiet hospitality offered without expectation, a place to rest, a shared meal, a gesture of recognition that transcended language. These moments, though brief, carried a kind of warmth that lingered beyond their brief duration. But they were not guaranteed. Each place held its own nature, its own disposition toward those who arrived from afar. Some were open, others guarded. Some offered assistance, others remained distant. The traveler could not assume one or the other. Each encounter had to be approached as new, shaped by its own conditions. Even within the caravan, the experience of these lands differed. Those who had traveled before moved with greater ease, their familiarity guiding their actions. They recognized patterns, understood certain customs, navigated interactions with a quiet confidence that came from experience. Others followed more cautiously, learning through observation, adjusting slowly to what could not be known in advance. In this way, knowledge became something shared but never complete. It passed between travelers in small ways, through guidance, through example, through the quiet correction of mistakes. Yet it could never fully prepare one for every encounter. Each place remained in some way unknown. And so the journey continued, not only across land, but across difference. The road no longer tested endurance alone. It tested perception, adaptability, and the ability to exist within spaces that did not offer immediate understanding. It required patience, not only with the self, but with others whose ways could not be easily grasped. Still, the caravan moved forward, through settlements and beyond them, carrying with it what it had gained and what it had lost, shaped not only by the land, but by the people who inhabited it. Each encounter left its mark, subtle but lasting, adding to the quiet transformation that the journey had already begun. For the traveler, the world was no longer singular. It had revealed itself as something varied, complex, and ever-changing, filled with voices that could not always be understood, yet could not be ignored. And within that understanding, the road stretched on, leading deeper into lands that would continue to challenge not only the body, but the very way the traveler came to see the world itself.
After long stretches of silence and distance, the markets did not reveal themselves all at once. They emerged slowly, as if rising from the land itself, first in sound, then in movement, and finally in form. The faint murmur of voices carried across the air, unfamiliar yet unmistakably human. Shapes gathered along the road, structures more numerous and closely set, pathways worn by frequent passage, signs of life layered upon one another in ways that the open land had long since forgotten. For those who had walked for so long beneath the quiet sky, the change felt almost overwhelming. The stillness that had defined the journey gave way to motion, the emptiness filled with color, texture, and sound. Where once there had been only the caravan and the road, now there were many others, travelers, traders, laborers, each moving with purpose, each carrying something to give or to take. The caravan slowed as it entered, not from hesitation, but from necessity. The flow of movement was no longer its own. It became part of something larger, guided by the rhythm of the place itself. Paths narrowed, voices overlapped, and the steady silence of the journey dissolved into a layered and shifting hum. The markets held a kind of wonder. Goods from distant lands were displayed in careful arrangement, objects shaped by hands that had never seen the road, yet had traveled it all the same. Fabrics of intricate design, metals polished to a quiet shine, vessels carved or molded with attention to detail. Spices, rare and fragrant, filled the air with scents that lingered, unfamiliar yet compelling. Each item carried a story, not spoken, but understood in its presence. It had come from somewhere beyond, passed through hands and across distances, shaped by the same road that now carried the caravan. To stand among these goods was to glimpse fragments of places never seen, lives never known, worlds that existed beyond the reach of a single journey. Yet beneath this sense of wonder, there was something else, an unease that settled quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. The markets, though full of life, were not places of rest in the way one might hope. They offered exchange, not comfort, movement, not stillness. The presence of many did not lessen the sense of caution, it deepened it. For in such places, value was everywhere, and where value gathered, so too did risk. The caravan, once bound closely together by necessity, now moved with greater awareness. Goods were not displayed carelessly. Each item was handled with attention, its place noted, its presence accounted for. What had been carried across such distance could not be allowed to slip away unnoticed. Trade began with observation. There was no rushing into exchange, no assumption that what was offered would be accepted without question. The travelers watched, listened, learned the subtle patterns of the market, how goods were presented, how value was expressed, how agreement was reached, not through shared language alone, but through gesture, timing, and restraint. Bargaining was not conflict, it was a form of communication.
Voices rose and fell, hands moved in quiet emphasis, expressions shifting in ways that carried meaning beyond words. What was offered at first was rarely what would be accepted in the end. There was a rhythm to it, a careful movement between giving and withholding, between interest and refusal. To those unfamiliar, it could seem uncertain, but to those who understood, it was precise. Each exchange carried weight, not only in what was gained or lost, but in how it was conducted. A misstep could lead to more than a poor trade. It could create tension, disrupt the fragile balance that allowed the market to function at all. And so the travelers moved carefully,
They offered their goods with quiet confidence, but without arrogance. They listened as much as they spoke, allowing the exchange to unfold rather than forcing it forward. It was a process that required patience, an understanding that value was not fixed but shaped by those who recognized it. There were moments of success. Goods long carried were exchanged for what was needed: fresh supplies, materials for repair, items that would hold greater value further along the road. These moments brought a kind of quiet satisfaction, not expressed openly, but felt in the subtle easing of burden, in the knowledge that the journey could continue with renewed strength. Yet even in success, the unease remained. The markets were not bound by the quiet unity of the caravan. They were filled with individuals whose purposes were not shared, whose intentions could not always be known. Trust here was more fragile, more conditional. There were those who watched too closely, those whose attention lingered not on trade but on opportunity. A moment of distraction, a lapse in awareness could be enough. What had been carried safely across distance could be lost in the space of a single interaction. And so vigilance did not fade, it changed. The dangers of the open road gave way to subtler risks, ones that did not announce themselves with force, but revealed themselves through absence, through the quiet realization that something once held was no longer there. Even rest, when taken within such places, was different. Shelter could be found, walls offering a sense of enclosure that the open land could not provide. But within those walls, the presence of others remained constant. Sounds did not fade into silence. Movement did not cease with night. The world continued around them, unbroken, filled with lives that did not pause for the passing of a single caravan. Sleep came differently here, less exposed, yet no more certain. The mind, accustomed to the vast quiet of the road, adjusted slowly to the closeness of the market. The presence of many did not bring ease. It required a different kind of awareness, one shaped not by distance, but by proximity. And when the time came to leave, it came without ceremony. The caravan gathered what it had gained, secured what remained, and moved once more toward the edge of the market. The noise began to fade behind them, the movement thinning, the land opening once again into the familiar expanse of the road. The transition was quiet, from many back to few, from noise back to silence. What remained was the memory of what had been seen and experienced, the colors, the voices, the exchanges, both successful and uncertain. These moments, though brief, became part of the journey, carried forward just as surely as any physical goods. For the markets, like the road itself, were not destinations, they were passages, places where the journey paused but did not end. Places of connection and risk, of wonder and unease, where the traveler glimpsed the wider world, even as they remained only a passing figure within it. And beyond them, the road continued, waiting once more to test what had been gained and what had yet to be lost.
In the beginning, time had been measured. It was counted in days since departure, in distances estimated between places, in the careful tracking of supplies that marked how far the journey might still extend. Each sunrise and sunset carried meaning, each stretch of road adding to a growing sense of progress. But as the journey continued, that sense began to change. Time did not stop, it simply lost its edges. Days no longer stood apart in clear distinction.
They blended one into the next until it became difficult to recall where one had ended and another had begun. The rhythm of the road, rise, walk, endure, rest, repeated itself with such quiet consistency that it ceased to feel like a series of separate moments and instead became something continuous, a single, unbroken passage. The traveler no longer marked the journey by distance alone. The land, vast and unyielding, offered little sense of advancement. The horizon remained distant, the path uncertain. What had once been measured in miles was now felt in something less precise, in the weight of the body, in the wear of the mind, in the slow accumulation of experience that could not be easily counted. Memory shifted with it. The early days of the journey, once clear and defined, began to soften at the edges. Details faded, not entirely, but enough to blur their certainty. The place of departure, the first steps onto the road, the faces of those left behind, these remained, but they felt farther away than distance alone could explain. What was immediate took their place. The present, with its steady demands, became the center of awareness. Each day required attention, and that attention left little room for reflection beyond what was necessary. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held the same clarity. It existed as something distant, like a place seen across a great expanse, visible yet unreachable. Even the future became uncertain. In the beginning, it had been imagined with a kind of quiet confidence. There would be an end to the journey, a place of arrival where the road would finally release its hold. But as time stretched on, that end became less defined. It remained ahead, somewhere beyond what could be seen, but it no longer felt near. It became something to move toward, not something to anticipate. Within the caravan, this change was shared. Conversations, when they occurred, rarely turned to how much time had passed. There was no need. Each person felt it in their own way, carried it within the body and the mind. The road had a way of making such measures unnecessary. Instead, time was marked by other things: the wearing down of tools and clothing, the gradual lightening or shifting of what was carried, the subtle changes in the land as one region gave way to another. These became the markers of passage, more reliable than any attempt to count days or weeks. Even the body kept its own record. Strength, once abundant, had been shaped by the journey. Movements had become more efficient, more deliberate. The rhythm of walking had settled deeply, no longer something to think about, but something that simply was. Fatigue, too, had changed, no longer a sudden force, but a constant presence, managed rather than resisted.
In this way, the traveler became part of the road, not separate from it, but shaped by it. The distinction between journey and life began to fade. What had once been seen as a passage from one place to another now felt like a condition in itself, a state of being that did not depend on arrival to hold meaning. There was a quiet acceptance in this, not resignation, but understanding. The road was not something that could be hurried. It unfolded at its own pace, revealing what it would when it would. To move against it was to invite strain without gain. To move with it was to find a steadier path, even if that path remained long. Still, there were moments when time seemed to return to awareness. A change in the season, subtle at first, then more certain. The angle of the sun shifting slightly, the length of shadows altering in ways that could not be ignored.
the air carrying a different quality, cooler or warmer depending on the land they crossed. These changes reminded the traveler that time had not disappeared, it had only changed form. It continued to move, quietly and without interruption, shaping the world as it reshaped those who moved through it. What felt endless was in truth passing. What seemed unchanging was slowly becoming something else. And yet, within the experience of the journey, it remained difficult to grasp. Days still blended, distances still stretched, the road still extended beyond what could be fully known. The sense of being within something vast and ongoing did not fade, it deepened. The traveler no longer sought to measure it. There was little purpose in doing so. What mattered was not how much time had passed, but how it had been endured. Each step taken, each hardship faced, each quiet moment of continuation, these became the true substance of the journey. Time, in its usual form, had lost its importance. In its place remained something simpler. The next step, the next hour, the next place where rest might be found. And beyond that, nothing that could be clearly held. Within this understanding, there was a kind of calm. Not the calm of ease, but the calm of acceptance. The journey was no longer something that could be contained within expectation or measured against a fixed end. It existed as it was, long, uncertain, and continuous. And the traveler, having moved so far within it, no longer resisted that truth. They carried it, just as they carried everything else, quietly, steadily, without needing to know how much farther it would go.
At first, loss did not seem inevitable. When the journey began, there had been a quiet belief, never fully spoken but present nonetheless, that what was carried would remain, that those who walked together would continue together, that the road, though difficult, would allow for preservation as much as progress. But the road did not preserve. It revealed. And over time it revealed that nothing carried across such distance could remain untouched. Loss did not arrive all at once. It came in small, almost unnoticeable ways, a strap that frayed and could not be repaired, a tool misplaced in the dim light of evening, its absence only discovered when it was needed again, a portion of food that spoiled sooner than expected, leaving less than had been planned. These things were accepted. They were part of the journey, expected in some measure, absorbed into the quiet adjustments that had become routine. What was lost was noted, accounted for, and then left behind, not only in place, but in thought. There was little use in holding on to what could not be recovered. But as the days passed, the losses deepened. Animals once steady and enduring began to falter. The strain of distance, of burden, of heat and cold and uneven ground took its toll in ways that could not always be prevented. A step that came too slowly, a pause that lasted too long, a weakness that did not pass with rest. At first it was subtle, a slight change in movement, a hesitation that might have been dismissed as fatigue, but the caravan had learned to notice such things. Attention turned quickly, quietly toward the animal in question. Its condition was observed, its burden adjusted, its pace allowed to slow. There was always hope that it would recover. Sometimes it did, but not always. When an animal could no longer continue, the truth became clear in a way that could not be avoided. The road required movement, and movement required strength. What could not move could not remain part of the journey. The decision was never lightly made.
The load it carried was redistributed, divided among what remained. The animal itself was left behind, its presence fading into the distance as the caravan moved on. There were no words spoken over it, no gestures to mark its passing, only a quiet understanding that it had carried what it could for as long as it could, and now it could go no farther. Such moments left a mark, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady. The caravan adjusted, as it always did, but something within the rhythm had changed. A presence once counted among them was now absent, and that absence did not fully disappear. It lingered. As the journey continued, other forms of loss followed. Goods carefully gathered and carried across distance were diminished through trade, through necessity, through moments where they could not be protected. What had once been abundant became measured more closely. What had once been certain became uncertain. Each loss required adaptation. The caravan grew lighter in some ways, yet more burdened in others. What remained carried greater importance, greater weight, not only in substance, but in meaning. There was less room for error, less margin for misjudgment.
And then there were losses that could not be replaced. Companions who had walked beside them, who had shared the rhythm of the journey, who had become part of its quiet continuity. These too could be taken by the road. Sometimes it came through illness, slow and unavoidable. Sometimes through accident, a misstep in uncertain terrain, a moment where balance failed and could not be regained. Sometimes through dangers that emerged without warning, leaving behind only absence where there had once been presence. These losses were different. They could not be adjusted for in the same way. There was no practical solution that could restore what had been. The caravan continued, as it had to, but the shape of it had changed. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, a silence where there had once been sound. There were no long pauses for mourning. The road did not allow for it. To stop was to risk more than could be afforded, and so grief was carried forward, folded into the journey itself. It was not set aside, but neither was it given space to fully unfold. It became something quieter, a presence that moved alongside the travelers, unspoken but understood. In time, the accumulation of these losses began to shape the journey in ways that could not be ignored. The caravan that had set out at the beginning was no longer the same. Its numbers had shifted, its burdens altered, its rhythm subtly changed by all that had been left behind. Even those who remained felt different, less certain, more aware of what could be lost without warning. There was no illusion left. The road did not guarantee arrival for all who began it. This understanding settled deeply. It did not bring fear in the way one might expect. That had come earlier, in sharper forms. What remained now was something steadier, a recognition of reality, accepted not with resistance, but with a kind of quiet clarity. To travel this road was to risk loss, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. The only unknown was what would be lost and when. And yet, despite this, the caravan continued. There was no other path. To turn back would not restore what had been lost. It would not undo the passage of time, nor return the journey to its beginning. The road extended in both directions, and what lay behind was no more certain than what lay ahead. So they moved forward, carrying what remained, remembering what had been, and accepting in a way that required no words that the journey was not only about what could be gained,
but about what would inevitably be left behind. In this acceptance, there was a kind of strength, not the strength of resistance, but the strength of continuation. Step by step, day by day, the caravan pressed on, shaped not only by distance and endurance, but loss itself, each absence becoming part of the path they followed, each memory carried as quietly as the weight of all that still remained.
There came a point when the journey was no longer carried by the body alone. The rhythm of walking, once something that required attention, had settled so deeply that it continued without thought. Steps followed one another in quiet succession, measured and steady, shaped by habit rather than intention. The body endured as it had learned to endure, through repetition, through necessity, through the slow adaptation to distance and strain. But the mind, freed from the need to guide each movement, began to change. At first, it turned toward memory. In the long stretches where the land offered little variation, where the horizon remained unchanged and the road revealed nothing new, thoughts drifted backward. The places left behind returned in fragments, familiar voices, the shape of a doorway, the feeling of stillness within walls that did not move. These memories came softly, without urgency, like distant echoes carried on the edge of awareness. They did not remain long. The present, though quiet, held its own demands. The body required attention, the road required care, and so the mind returned again and again to what was immediate. Yet each time it drifted, it carried something back with it, a sense of distance, of separation, of how far the journey had carried them from what once felt permanent. Over time, the nature of thought began to shift. Memory alone was no longer enough to fill the long hours. The mind, left without clear direction, began to move in less certain ways. It wandered not only to what had been, but to what might be, to what could have been, to possibilities that had no place on the road itself. These thoughts were not always clear. They rose and faded without structure, blending together in ways that made them difficult to follow. A memory might lead into an imagined conversation. A distant place might merge with one already known. Time itself seemed to loosen, allowing past and present to exist side by side without distinction. The journey, once something external, began to take on an inward form. The silence of the road made space for this. Where there had once been distraction, voices, movement, the constant presence of others, there was now openness. The land did not demand attention in the same way. It stretched outward, unchanging, offering little to anchor the mind to a single point. And so the mind moved freely. Sometimes it brought a kind of calm. There were moments when thought slowed, when awareness settled into the simple rhythm of movement, step, breath, step. The repetition created a quiet steadiness, a sense of presence that required no effort to maintain. In these moments, the journey felt almost effortless, as though the body and the road had aligned in a way that required nothing more. But this calm was not constant. There were other times when the mind drifted too far. Fatigue, heat, and the unbroken passage of time began to blur perception. The line between what was seen and what was imagined grew less certain. Shapes on the horizon seemed to shift, to take on forms that did not hold when approached. Sounds carried farther than they should, or appeared where none existed. The traveler became aware of this, but not always in time to prevent it.
A figure glimpsed in the distance might linger in thought, even after it had been revealed as nothing more than shadow. A voice, faint and indistinct, might seem real for a moment before fading into silence. These experiences were brief, often subtle, but they left an impression, a quiet uncertainty. The mind, once trusted without question, could no longer be relied upon in the same way. This realization did not come as a sudden shock. It emerged gradually, shaped by repetition, by the growing awareness that perception itself could be altered by the conditions of the journey. The road did not only test the body, it tested the way the world was understood. Within the caravan, this was rarely spoken of. Each traveler experienced it in their own way, carrying the change inward rather than outward. There was no language for it that could fully express what was happening, and even if there had been, there was little purpose in giving it voice. The journey required continuation, not explanation. And so the mind was managed as the body was managed, through awareness, through restraint, through the quiet effort to remain present, even when thought pulled elsewhere. Simple habits became anchors: the counting of steps, the observation of breath, the focus on immediate tasks. These provided structure where the mind might otherwise drift too far. They were not conscious strategies, but natural responses to the conditions of the road. Still, the wandering did not stop. It became part of the journey, just as thirst and fatigue had become part of it. Something to be recognized, adjusted to, carried forward without resistance. There were moments when it deepened into something more. The sense of self, once stable, began to feel less fixed. The traveler, who had once been defined by place, by routine, by the familiar boundaries of a known world, now existed within a space that offered none of those things. Identity itself seemed to stretch, shaped by distance and experience. Who they had been before the journey felt distant. Who they were becoming was not yet clear. This in-between state lingered, neither unsettling nor comforting, but simply present. It was another aspect of the road, one that could not be seen, but could be felt. And as the days continued to pass, as the rhythm of movement remained unbroken, the mind adapted in its own way. It learned to wander without losing itself entirely, to drift and return, to exist within the vastness of the journey without being consumed by it. There was a quiet resilience in this, not the resilience of strength alone, but of flexibility, the ability to change without breaking, to endure not only what was external, but what arose from within. The road, in its silence, had made space for this transformation, and the traveler, whether aware of it or not, had begun to change in ways that would not easily be undone. For the journey was no longer only across land, it had become a passage through the mind itself, unfolding slowly, without clear direction, yet carrying them forward all the same. There came a point in the journey when the road ahead no longer felt inevitable. Until then, movement had carried its own certainty. Each day followed the last, each step led naturally into the next, and the act of continuing required little more than endurance. The path, though uncertain in its direction, had never been questioned in its necessity. But over time, as distance deepened and the weight of the journey settled fully into the body and mind, another possibility began to take shape: the thought of turning back. It did not arrive suddenly. It emerged quietly, often in moments of stillness, at the edge of rest, in the fading light of evening, or in the long hours when the road stretched forward without change.
It was not a desire at first, but a consideration, a simple recognition that the path behind still existed, just as the path ahead did. For the first time, the journey felt like a choice once more. What had been set in motion could, in theory, be undone. The road that had been walked could be walked again in reverse. The distance already endured could be retraced, step by step, until the familiar world returned. It was a simple idea, and yet it carried a weight that could not be easily dismissed. The traveler began to measure things differently, not in distance alone, but in cost. What had been given to the journey, time, strength, goods, companions, was no longer abstract. It had accumulated, shaped by every day that had passed. To continue forward meant risking more of the same. To turn back meant preserving what remained, but at the cost of abandoning what had already been invested. Neither path was without consequence. The road ahead held uncertainty, as it always had. There was no guarantee of arrival, no assurance that the remaining distance could be endured. What lay beyond might demand more than what remained to give. But the road behind was no longer the same as it had once been. Time had passed, conditions had changed. What had been known at the beginning might not remain so. The places left behind might have shifted, altered by events that could not be predicted. Even if the path could be retraced, the world it led back to might not be the one remembered. And the traveler, too, had changed. The person who had stood at the beginning of the journey no longer existed in the same way. The road had reshaped them, through hardship, through loss, through the quiet accumulation of experience that could not be undone. To return would not be to arrive somewhere different. Within the caravan, this tension was felt, though rarely spoken. Each traveler carried it in their own way, weighing the journey against themselves, measuring what remained against what had already been given. Some moved with quiet determination, their focus fixed ahead, unwilling to dwell on the possibility of turning back. Others hesitated, not in their steps, but in their thoughts, their awareness lingering on the path behind.
There were moments when the choice became more immediate. A stretch of land that proved more difficult than expected, supplies that ran lower than planned, the absence of something that had once seemed certain. In such moments, the thought of turning back grew stronger, no longer distant but present. It pressed quietly against the will to continue. For some, it became too strong to ignore. They made their decision not with ceremony, but with quiet resolve. There was no grand declaration, no attempt to persuade others to follow. The road was shared, but the choice was individual. When the moment came, they simply stopped moving forward. A small shift, a turning of direction, and then they began to walk the other way. There were no guarantees for them. The path behind held its own dangers, its own uncertainties. To leave the caravan was to give up the shared strength it provided, to face the journey alone or with only a few who made the same choice. It was not an easier path, only a different one. Those who remained watched in silence. There was no judgment, no attempt to call them back. Each understood in their own way what had led to that decision. The road demanded much, and not all could or would give the same amount. And so the caravan continued, with fewer than before. For those who stayed, the departure of others left its own mark. It sharpened the awareness of choice, made it more immediate, more real. The journey was no longer something that simply unfolded. It was something actively chosen again and again with each step forward. There was a quiet strength in that realization. To continue was not an act of habit alone, but of intention.
It required a willingness to accept what lay ahead, without certainty, without guarantee. It required trust, not in the road, which offered none, but in the ability to endure whatever it might bring. Still, the thought of turning back did not disappear. It lingered at the edges of awareness, returning in moments of strain, of doubt, of quiet reflection. It remained a possibility, always present, never fully dismissed. But with each passing day, it grew more distant, not because the road became easier, but because the journey itself had changed. What lay ahead, though unknown, had begun to take on a different meaning. It was no longer just a destination to be reached, but a continuation of something already deeply lived. The traveler, having come so far, no longer stood at the beginning of a choice. They stood within it. And to turn back from that point was not simply to reverse direction, it was to leave behind the path they had already become part of. So they continued, step by step, with the quiet understanding that the road ahead would demand more, that the uncertainties would not lessen, that the journey would not offer easy answers. And yet they moved forward, not because the path was certain, but because for them it had become the only path that remained.
There came a time when the road began to change in feeling, even if it did not change in truth. The landscape still stretched outward in the same quiet vastness. The horizon still held its distance without yielding, and the sky remained unchanged in its steady presence above. And yet, something subtle had shifted in the way the journey was experienced. The traveler no longer moved through pure uncertainty alone. There were signs now, faint, often inconsistent, but present nonetheless, that suggested nearness to places once spoken of only in stories. The rhythm of the land began to vary in ways that could not be ignored. Paths grew more defined. Movement increased in certain directions. The occasional structure appeared where before there had been only emptiness. It was not a rival, but it was not the same distance as before. Within the caravan, this change was felt deeply, though not always with clarity. After so long in lands that offered no indication of progress, even the smallest suggestion of proximity carried weight. Conversations, once sparse and practical, began to carry a different tone, less about survival alone and more about what might come next. Still, certainty remained out of reach. For every sign of nearness, there was another reminder of distance. A day of easier travel might be followed by terrain that resisted movement. A settlement might appear, only to give way again to emptiness beyond it. The road did not resolve itself into clarity. It continued to alternate between promise and delay, never fully committing to either. And so expectation had to be tempered. Hope, if it arose, was never allowed to become certainty. The travelers had learned too well what it meant to assume too much from the road. Yet something in them began to shift regardless. The body, so long accustomed to endless continuation, began to sense that continuation might eventually reach a point of change, not an end in the sense of finality, but a transition, something that would alter the rhythm that had defined so much of their lives. The mind, too, responded. Thoughts that long had been shaped by repetition and endurance began to turn toward what lay beyond it. What would it mean to stop, to remain in one place for longer than a single rest, to no longer measure time by movement or strength by distance? These questions did not have clear answers. They were not spoken aloud in full, but they existed within the spaces between words, within the pauses that followed long days of travel.
each traveler considered them differently, shaped by their own experience of the journey, their own understanding of what had been endured. And still, the road continued to unfold. The caravan moved through regions that felt increasingly inhabited. The presence of others became more frequent, not in passing alone, but in settled forms. Fields appeared where land had once been open. Roads intersected with greater regularity. The sense of isolation that had defined earlier stages of the journey began to soften. With this came a different kind of awareness. No longer was every encounter unexpected. There were patterns now, recognizable forms of movement, trade, and passage. The traveler began to understand, in fragments, how deeply connected these distant regions were, how the road itself was less a single path and more a network of countless intersecting lives.
What had once seemed remote was now part of a larger continuity. And yet, despite this growing familiarity, the destination itself remained indistinct. It was always just beyond the next stretch, just beyond the next horizon. The sense of nearing did not resolve into arrival. Instead, it stretched the awareness of distance in a new way. Less overwhelming, perhaps, but more complex. Because nearness created expectation, and expectation carried its own weight. Within the caravan, this was felt as a quiet tension. The body continued its accustomed labor, but the mind no longer rested entirely in endurance. It began to look forward, cautiously, toward an outcome that had long been abstract, but was now becoming more tangible. Even so, restraint remained. The road had taught too thoroughly the danger of assuming completion before it had truly arrived. And so hope existed, but carefully held. It was present, but not allowed to lead. There were moments when the destination seemed almost visible, a city appearing in the distance, larger and more structured than those seen before, movement within it suggesting permanence, not transience. The sense that here, perhaps, was a place where the road no longer extended forward in the same way. But even then, arrival was not immediate. There were still distances to cross, still obstacles to pass, still time to endure before any true conclusion could be reached. And so the journey continued. Each step now carried a different kind of awareness, not only of endurance, but of proximity, not only of survival, but of transition. The road was still the road, but it was no longer experienced in the same way as before. It was approaching something, though what that something truly was remained just beyond full understanding. And the traveler, having come so far, moved within that uncertainty with a quiet steadiness, no longer entirely defined by departure, but not yet defined by arrival, suspended, as always, between what had been and what was still to come.
There are parts of a journey where the distance no longer feels like distance, not because it has lessened, but because the mind can no longer hold it in the same way. After so many days, so many changes of land and light, the idea of far begins to lose its sharpness. What once felt like an expanse beyond measure becomes something that can only be endured in segments, morning to midday, midday to evening, evening to rest. And so it was in the final stretches of the road. The land here no longer carried the same harshness that had defined earlier stages of the journey. The desert's emptiness had long been left behind, and the mountains had receded into memory. In their place came rolling terrain, uneven but passable, marked more by signs of life than by resistance. Villages appeared more frequently now,
not as distant silhouettes, but as settled places with continuity, smoke rising at predictable hours, paths worn by repeated use, fields tended with quiet regularity. There was a sense here that time moved differently, not in isolation, but in rhythm with others who remained rooted in place. For the traveler, this created a strange feeling, familiarity without belonging. The caravan passed through these spaces as it had passed through all others, observing, exchanging, continuing onward. But now, the difference between passing through and remaining became more visible. Life was no longer only something carried along a road, it was something that existed beside it, independent of its movement. And with each passing settlement, the sense of nearness deepened. There was no longer speculation about whether the journey would end, only uncertainty about when and how that ending would arrive. The idea of a final destination was no longer abstract. It had taken form in the collective awareness of the caravan, shaping movement in subtle ways. Pace changed, not in haste, but in attention. Steps became more measured, pauses more deliberate. There was a quiet awareness that each moment might be among the last of its kind, that the rhythm of the road, once so constant, might soon give way to something entirely different. Within the caravan, conversation shifted again. Less about endurance, less about survival, and more about recognition. Landmarks began to be identified with increasing certainty. Routes were no longer guessed at, but confirmed. There was a growing sense that what lay ahead was not infinite continuation, but a defined point of arrival. And yet, even this understanding was not absolute. The road had taught too well the danger of assuming completion too early. So even as nearness became undeniable, it was held with caution. Expectation was present, but restrained. Hope existed, but was tempered by memory of how often distance had reasserted itself when it seemed smallest. Still, something had changed. The body felt it first. A subtle easing, not of effort, but of pressure. The constant strain that had defined so much of the journey began to lessen in ways that were difficult to name. Not because the work had become easy, but because it was no longer endless in the same way.
The mind followed. It no longer wandered in the same direction as before. The long cycles of uncertainty, of drifting thought and distant reflection began to settle. Attention returned more frequently to the present, not because the present was demanding more, but because it felt more meaningful. Even the air seemed different, less like something to be endured, more like something that belonged to places rather than passage. There was a softness to it that had not been present in the harsher regions of the road. There were hints of stability, of permanence, of lives lived without the constant necessity of movement. And still, the caravan continued. Because arrival, though near, was not yet complete, there were still paths to follow, still gates or boundaries or final crossings that had not yet been reached. The destination existed now not as a concept, but as a place that would have to be entered, crossed into, experienced, understood. What that would mean was not yet fully known. For so long the journey had been defined by movement through space. To stop moving in the same way would mean the loss of something deeply familiar, even if that loss was also the fulfillment of purpose. This awareness lingered quietly among the travelers, not as fear, but as recognition. The road had shaped them in ways that could not be easily set aside, and now, as it began to loosen its hold,
There was an awareness that something within them would have to adjust once more. But that moment had not yet arrived. There was still forward motion, still distance to cover, still the quiet continuation of steps that had become second nature over time. The destination remained ahead, closer than it had ever been, but not yet here. And so, with a steady rhythm that had carried them through all that had come before, the caravan moved into the final stretches of the road, where every step felt both familiar and newly significant, as if the journey itself were beginning to understand that it was approaching its own end. It did not happen in a single moment. There was no clear boundary where the road ended and arrival began, no sudden stopping of movement, no final step that announced completion. Instead, it came gradually, as all things in the journey had come, through subtle change, through quiet recognition, through the slow easing of distance, until it could no longer be mistaken for what it once was. The caravan noticed it first in the land. The path, once uncertain and shifting, had become fully defined. Roads widened and met others with intention, forming networks that no longer felt temporary or improvised. Structures stood with permanence, built not for passage but for dwelling. The movement of people here was not driven by departure or arrival. It was steady, rooted, continuous. And then, at last, the place that had been spoken of in fragments along the journey revealed itself in full. A city, not seen from afar in fleeting outline, but present in its entirety, vast and structured, rising not from emptiness, but from accumulated time. Walls enclosed it, not as barrier alone, but as definition. Gates marked transition not from unknown to known, but from journey to settlement. The caravan slowed as it approached, not from hesitation, but from the weight of recognition. This was not a place to pass through. It was a place where passing ended. The rhythm that had defined every day, the steady continuation forward, no longer extended in the same way. At the threshold, movement softened. The road did not vanish behind them. It remained, stretching outward in both directions, but its meaning had changed. What had been a path of necessity became a path of memory. The forward motion that had carried them so far reached a point where it no longer demanded continuation, and so they entered, not as strangers breaking into a new world, nor as conquerors claiming arrival, but as travelers completing something that had defined them for longer than they could easily recall. The gates opened without resistance, as if acknowledging what had already been understood. Inside, the city was alive in a way that differed from all that had been seen before. It did not move with the urgency of travel, nor the stillness of isolation. It held a balance of labor and rest, of exchange and permanence, of lives unfolding within fixed space rather than across distance. Time here was not measured in steps taken along a road, but in cycles of return to the same places, the same patterns, the same continuity. For the travelers, this was unfamiliar. The body, so long shaped by movement, felt the absence of forward pressure. The ground beneath them did not ask to be crossed. The space around them did not require traversal. There was stillness here that was not emptiness, but structure. The mind responded in its own way. After so long defined by motion, it adjusted slowly to the absence of necessity. Thoughts that had once followed the rhythm of survival and endurance now had space to settle differently. The urgency that had accompanied every decision softened, replaced by a quieter awareness of presence.
And beneath it all, something deeper shifted. The identity that had been formed through the journey, the traveler, the one who moves, the one who continues despite uncertainty, no longer had the same shape. It did not disappear, but it no longer defined in the same way. Arrival did not erase the road, it recontextualized it. What had been endured did not fade, it remained present, within the body, within memory, within the quiet understanding that everything seen and experienced had been real and had been necessary to reach this point. Around them, life continued. The city did not pause for their arrival, it absorbed them gently, as it did all who came from beyond its edges. There was no ceremony required for transition, no final acknowledgement beyond what was already understood. The journey had reached its end, not in disappearance, but in transformation. What came after was not defined by the road, but by what would be built upon its completion. And for a long moment, perhaps the first in all the long passage of time that had carried them here, the traveler stood without movement, not because the road demanded it, but because it no longer did. The road had ended, and in its place something else had begun.